Think about the last nature documentary that you watched. Chances are good that at some point it covered one of Earth's most fascinating places, the tropical rainforest. Rightly so. The richness and diversity of species found within is so amazing, it would take several museums just to cover the top of the tip of that iceberg. We learn about them as early as grade school, and hear about the dangers that they face constantly in the news. So much so that the word rainforest has become ubiquitous in popular culture. You can eat at the Rainforest Cafe, watch a mystical rainforest come to life on the big screen in James Cameron's Avatar, or even drink rainforest-certified coffee. All of this hype is rightly gained. Not only are these ecosystems absolutely, stunningly, IMAX-worthy beautiful, but they're important as well. There are estimates that between 40 to 75% of all known biotic species live in rainforests, and that rainforests are responsible for over 20% of the world's oxygen turnover. Over 25% of all natural medicines have been discovered in rainforests, and many delicious foods like chocolate, bananas, mangoes, avocados, and macadamia nuts all originally derive from them. It's easy to see why rainforests get the attention that they've garnered. But what if I told you that there's a different type of rainforest, one that exists entirely underwater? You may have even run into one and simply unknowingly passed it by. These comparatively small forests may not be as big or as sexy as the towering trees and the thick underbrush of the true terrestrial jungles, but I can guarantee you that with just a little time and a critical eye, you'll find that these aquatic canopies of green are no less beautiful or important than their rainy counterparts on land. And you don't even have to go far offshore to find them. Oh hey, I didn't see you there. You're listening to Bio-Diversity, the podcast about pelagic paradigms and coral curiosities, where we bring the best in flippin' fun fish facts straight to your ear holes. It's like we're the delivery drivers of peer-reviewed aquatic science, the Grubhub of fish food for your mind, the DoorDash of dope decapods. Here on the show, we examine the weird, the wacky, and the wonderful diversity of life that lives under the crashing waves of our blue home. Using cutting-edge science as our guide, we dive deep into both the common and the rare, the exotic and the ugly. So tune in for the tuna, stick around for the scorpionfish. Let's descend. Today on the show, seagrass. Ha! Thought I was going to talk about kelp forests, didn't you? Not today. Well, kelp forests are definitely incredible and deserving of their own episode. Today, we're going even smaller. We're going to do a deep dive into a selection of species that exist in not-so-deep waters, and talk about meadows of green grass in the sunlit shallows. The comparison with rainforest isn't all bluster, either. By the end of the show, I hope you're convinced that these fields are just as important and newsworthy as the jungles themselves. My fascination with seagrasses comes from a particular seagrass meadow that I am in absolute love with. Down in Roatan, off the coast of Honduras, Central America, lives a dive resort called Cocoa View. I've been there several times on vacation, and it's one of my favorite spots. The diving is all around phenomenal, but there's one site that I am particularly fond of, and it's literally steps away from the restaurant. These waters are open 24/7 to divers at the resort, and they hold some of the most enjoyable shore diving I think I've ever done. Just a short swim away from the shoreline are two coral walls that face each other, creating a valley of sand in between them that cradles the wreck of a 140-foot tanker ship. The whole place actually combines 3 separately named dive sites, but they refer to the whole thing as the Cocoa View front yard. And just like the yard of a house in a stodgy, stuck-up neighborhood of rich person suburbia, this yard has a blanket of green, beautiful grass. Lush, green, short leaves of seagrass grow from the sandy bottom, often in less than 5 feet of water. The meadow stretches out in all directions, providing a wonderful, scenic surface swim out to the coral heads and eventually, the coral walls. In my trips there, I have noted a behavioral pattern that happens in a lot of the other divers. They treat that swaying seagrass meadow as kind of an afterthought. Coral reef, after all, is much cooler and much more interesting to look at. That's the thought, anyway. Whether the excitement of a new dive takes them blazing past the meadows to get out to the reef, or the promise of food at the end of the dive makes them soar all the way back to shore, a lot of divers don't really turn a critical eye to the short plants that blanket the sand between. But honestly, I have found an absolutely stunning array of cool things in that meadow, and I can guarantee that spending time in the meadows is absolutely worth it. My best find in that meadow was a juvenile spotted moray eel. This little baby eel slithering through the grass bed was absolutely mesmerizing to watch. Even though its mottled black and white patterning should have been really easy to spot and stood out among the green, its lithe and graceful movements made it pretty hard to spot. That eel is just one of several cool things that I have found out amongst the seagrass. There's these adorable yellow, black and blue baby sergeant major fish, gliding, graceful southern stingrays, sunlight glinting barracudas, and even alien octopuses. I wasn't able to find any concrete metrics, but the species richness that can be found amongst seagrass meadows in such shallow water is said to rival that even of the coral reefs themselves. They provide food for others, they produce oxygen for us to breathe, and protect our coastlines from erosions and storms. They're both engineers and fighters for the earth. These seagrasses work all these thankless jobs and are absolutely beautiful to boot. So today, we're going to learn about these amazing plants as a way of saying thanks for everything that they do. Seagrass meadows are one of the most overlooked ecosystems on Earth, despite the fact that some grass beds, like a particular one on a seabank in the Red Sea, are so large that they can literally be seen from space. We give so much credit to the Great Wall of China for accomplishing this feat, so why not show a little of that love to the seagrass? Seagrasses is a term that is used to refer to a collection of 72 different species of plant found all across the globe. These 72 species are further delineated into 4 families. I'm going to absolutely butcher the pronunciation of these, but the 4 families are Cymodoceraceae, Hydrocheridaceae, Poseidonaceae, and Zosteraceae. We see a lot of variation in both structure and form across these 4 families, anything from the long, narrow leaves of the turtlegrass all the way down to the short and oval leaves of paddlegrass. Lengths of these leaves can vary from just a few short centimeters all the way up to an impressive 7 meters long in the longest recorded seagrass leaf. So the first big thing to learn about seagrass is this. It's actually a plant. But duh, right? Well, this is actually a little bit bigger of a deal than one thinks at face value, because it means a couple of things that we don't necessarily realize. First, it is the only type of plant that we know of that is actually truly marine. Every single other plant is terrestrial, meaning that it lives on land. Secondly, it means that they are vastly, vastly different from seaweeds and kelps. This was touched on briefly in a previous episode, but seaweeds are not plants. In fact, most of them are algae. While both of them do utilize sunlight to photosynthesize, that's not enough to be able to call a seaweed a plant. Seagrasses have so much more in common with terrestrial plants than they do with their algal seaweed counterparts. To start with, seagrasses have roots. And if you've never been excited about the word roots before, prepare to change your whole worldview, because seagrass roots are, and I do not use this phrase lightly or too much, incredible and amazing. We typically think of plants as discrete units. For example, when we think of the root system of a pine tree, we think of the network of roots expanding out underneath the trunk into the soil. But that's it. It both starts and ends with that one pine tree, its roots, trunk, branches, and needles. Seagrasses still have this complex web of roots, but they have an additional piece of how their root system works, and this piece is called a rhizome. It's a little hard to picture, so I'll try to link a photo in the show notes, but for the sake of visualization, imagine an aspen tree, with its artworthy network of roots just below where the trunk meets the dirt. Now, right at that spot, just underneath the soil, place a large circular tube, a plant stem, and a pretty large one at that, running left and right perpendicular to the trunk of the tree. This is called the rhizome. Top side of that rhizome, the trunk and the tree and everything that you see above ground grows, and on the bottom side, that familiar root structure shooting out into the soil. Now, further imagine that this tube keeps growing away from the tree, keeping underneath the surface and expanding the root system further and further away. But then, suddenly, bam! A new tree begins to grow out of the rhizome, reaching upwards towards the sky. This process repeats and repeats, growing more and more trees until you have a grove of them, all grown from the same plant, the same DNA. In effect, each tree shooting skyward is a direct genetic clone of all of the others it is connected to by the rhizome. Above the ground, they look like individual trees, but subsurface, they're all connected, root system and all, by this special structure, the rhizome. Bopping off the tree analogy, seagrasses also have these rhizomes, so, by extension, this is also one method of how they grow. The rhizome spreads out underneath the sediment, sending up new shoots as they expand. In effect, this means that large portions of seagrass meadows are actually just one plant. To think that what looks to your eye to be a separate, discrete stem of seagrass is actually a genetic clone of the stems surrounding it, and that they are all connected to each other to boot. This method of expansion and growth is called clonal growth, and it is not seen in just seagrasses either. Do you have turmeric powder in your kitchen? It's made from the boiled, dried, and ground rhizome of the turmeric plant. And that aspen tree explanation I used for the visualization earlier? It's actually true. Aspen trees also form these interconnected clonal colonies connected by a rhizome. I wasn't just making it up for the sake of an explanation. Bam! What a twist. It's very twisty. Call me M. Night Shyamalan. Clonal growth isn't the only way that seagrasses can reproduce and grow, either. Clonal growth is, by definition, asexual, meaning that it doesn't take two to tango. But, just like crop plants, trees, and flowers on land, seagrass can actually sexually reproduce as well. And they do it almost exactly like flowering plants on land do it too. And that means they pollinate.
Oh, yeah.
A surface-level overview of plant sexual reproduction goes like this. In most flowering plants, the flowers contain both a male part called a stamen and a female part called a pistil. The stamen is able to produce these tiny little grains that contain genetic material, called pollen grains. Aggregated together, these grains are collectively known as pollen. When these pollen grains from the male stamen contacts the female part of a flower, preferably another flower, but in some cases the same flower, fertilization occurs. The genetic material of the two flowers are combined, and this fertilization is what we refer to as pollination. This is usually where bumblebees or butterflies enter the picture. They are a primary agent that carries pollen from one flower to another. After pollination occurs, the flower begins to produce seeds that, once developed, can be dispersed by winds or animal activity to find new soil upon which to grow. Again, that's a very surface-level overview of plant reproduction. It can be way more fascinating and complex than that, but that little tiny bit of information is helpful because seagrasses do it almost exactly the same way. It is worth noting, however, that unlike a lot of land plants, most species of seagrasses actually don't have flowers with both male and female parts, instead having male plants with male flowers and female plants with female flowers. Just like land flowers, though, the male flowers produce the pollen grains, and in a strange twist of my pollen is bigger than your pollen, seagrass pollen can be up to 5 millimeters in length, compared to the average terrestrial plant size of 0.1 millimeters. That's 50 times larger. Go big or go home, garden variety flowers. Once the pollen is produced and released, though, we run into a little bit of a problem. If you're a male flower, how does your pollen reach another flower reliably, especially if the nearest flowers are genetic clones of yourself? What would a genetic clone of me even do with my own genetic material? Actually, on second thought, don't answer that. Hilariously, some grass species actually can self-pollinate, like one species that will produce male flowers at one time and female flowers at a different time. But this reduces what scientists call genetic variation. Variation in genetics across populations is actually a huge benefit to your species as a whole, so it makes sense that you want to combine your genetics with another plant's if you want your species to survive. So, the problem remains. In land plants, the pollinators like the bees and the butterflies really help with the dispersal of pollen, but I don't know about you, I've never seen a bumblebee in a scuba suit before. The answer that seagrasses have come up with to combat this problem is twofold. First, the pollen, although large, actually has similar density to seawater, so instead of sinking, it actually floats or is neutrally buoyant in the water. And anything that floats at the mercy of the tumultuous surges and currents of the sea is bound to travel. Secondly, there is some evidence that small crustaceans and other invertebrates might actually feed on the pollen and can act much in the same way that insects do on land, as pollinators that can carry the pollen from one flower to another. So it's not so much the birds and the bees as it is the shrimps and the worms. Nice. Once pollinated, the female flowers produce seeds, combining their genetics with the genetics of the pollen grains that they happen to receive. This bolsters the population by increasing that genetic variation. Once produced, the seeds are released. Seagrass seeds are neutrally buoyant, meaning that they won't sink right away. Floating seeds can be carried by the motion of the ocean for great distances, several miles before they find a new home in the sediment and begin to germinate. Once planted, the seeds begin their process of growing their own roots, rhizomes, and sprouting blades, and the process begins anew. Seeds of seagrasses can potentially spread even further if they're eaten by fish and are able to pass through their digestive tracts unscathed. This may all seem mundane, as this is exactly how land plants reproduce and grow as well, a story that we've been told since grade school. But if you take a moment to truly appreciate the nuance of how each and every one of these processes has had to evolve to adapt to the marine environment, from the buoyant density of the pollen grains to the utilization of a different type of pollinator, you can truly begin to see something very special about these hitherto overlooked blades of green. Also, just a quick side note, if you're an evolutionary nerd like I am, it's absolutely fascinating to think about where the lineages of these marine plants came from, because land plants, which they evolved from, actually came from algae in the sea long ago. So if you really think about it, it all started with algae, which evolved into plants that lived on land, which then went back to the water to evolve into plants that are adapted to the marine environment. And that is just so bonkers nuts to me. I frickin' love it. We have a picture now of how seagrasses look, grow, and reproduce, which would be cool enough on its own. But as a good man once said, "But wait, there's more!" The next burning question is this: why are seagrasses so important? Well, I can assure you, they are important. And it's not just the myriad of animal species that call the seagrass meadows their home, but they're also universally critical to your existence as a human as well. First up, let's take a look at why they're important for the critters of the sea. I mentioned before that seagrass meadows serve as an important habitat for many marine species, potentially rivaling the biodiversity of the coral reef itself. But there are a few important traits of seagrass meadows that stand out and set them apart in my mind. Firstly, let's return to the basic concept of the food chain, or, again, more accurately, the food web. Without seagrass, some of the most important marine food webs couldn't exist, because they serve as a foundation, that base of the web that without it, the rest would crumble and fall. Ecologists have a special name for such species: primary producers. Just like land plants, seagrasses utilize the nutrients they absorb from the seafloor sediments by their roots, as well as the sunlight filtering to their leaves, to be able to create their own food in a process known as photosynthesis. They make their own food, grow, and spread out so that they, in turn, can serve as food. Sea turtles, manatees, and dugongs are among the creatures known to graze on the seagrass. In addition, it has been found that some bacteria utilize the surface of the seagrass to grow, and small snails, crustaceans, and other invertebrates can utilize these bacteria as food. Of course, bigger animals can then eat those invertebrates before they are eaten, continuing the cycle. Seagrass meadows aren't just food either. They serve an important role as what scientists call a nursery habitat. You might have heard this term before if you've watched BBC's Blue Planet when they talked about mangroves, which is another nursery habitat. And I'm sure my voice could never measure up to Sir David Attenborough's dulcet narration, but I'm here to use it to defend seagrass as an equally important nursery. I still love you, mangroves, but we gotta give the grasses their due. When scientists say nursery habitat, what they mean is a place that provides food, shelter, and protection for juveniles of a species. And man oh man, do seagrasses have juvenile critters in spades. For small fish, the thick canopy of the grass provides great hiding spots. The ample bacteria and small invertebrate populations provide food. The seagrass also helps provide protection from the elements as well. And it's not just small and baby fish that the seagrass canopy supports. Seagrass also supports important algae growth, crustaceans, sponges, bivalves, worms, and even sea anemones. The list goes on and on and on and on. Fun science aside, the rate at which these animals spawn and grow has a special term. The term productivity, in an ecological context, refers to how fast biomass is generated within a particular ecosystem. When comparing a nursery habitat to any other habitat where you might find juveniles, the productivity of nursery habitats is much, much higher. This is one way that we actually define nurseries as nurseries. So, what do all of these small animals attract? Larger animals, of course, all looking for a meal. Because of the incredible amount of small life forms inhabiting the beds, bigger animals love to pay them a visit. I'm talking octopuses, squid, larger crabs, sea urchins, sharks, turtles, cuttlefish, eels, stingrays. Need I go on? Can you start to see why I am absolutely baffled that people often pass over these habitats when they're diving or snorkeling? The amount of discoveries to be made in just a few feet of water are endless, and we're not done yet. Remember, seagrasses are also incredibly vital to us as humans, too. You're already familiar with the first reason why. In fact, you're breathing it in right now. Oxygen, that life-sustaining gas which we use for respiration, is produced by seagrasses. They are plants, after all, so it stands to reason. But, on the off chance that you didn't know, oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis. At a basic level, plants utilize carbon dioxide and sunlight to produce sugar and oxygen. But what you didn't know is that seagrass beds are actually responsible for more oxygen production on Earth than the rainforests. Is your mind blown? 'Cause mine was. 1 square meter of seagrass bed can actually generate up to 10 liters of oxygen per day. I got a little bit curious and did some garbage math to see if I could come up with some numbers for a clickbait shock value, and this is what I found. One paper from March of this year, 2020, estimates that the global total area of seagrass beds on Earth is to be at least 160,387 square kilometers, but possibly up to 266,562 square kilometers. If we assume the worst and take the lowest estimate here, that equates to 160,387,000 square meters of seagrass beds alive as of 2020. Multiply that by 10, and you get a total of 1,603,873,000 liters of oxygen produced per day. Now, it's estimated that, on average, a single person consumes 550 liters of oxygen per day. So we take that ridiculously high number and divide it by 550 to get enough oxygen from seagrass beds to sustain 2,916,127 people each day. If we take the higher estimate from earlier, that math works out to support 4,846,581 people. Granted, I called it garbage math earlier for a reason, and those reasons are that it fails to account for several factors. It just assumes that all of the produced oxygen isn't being utilized or dissolved into the water column, for instance. But it still paints an interesting picture that seagrasses are like tiny, tiny forests, providing oxygen for many creatures that rely on that precious resource. In fact, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reports that 50 to 80% of all oxygen production on Earth comes from the ocean, and seagrass beds are a pretty important part of that number. Oxygen isn't the only service that seagrass provides to humans either. Throughout history, seagrasses have been harvested and utilized in a variety of ways, from weaving material for seagrass baskets to roofing or insulation for housing, and even fertilizer for certain crops. The uses of seagrass throughout history are staggering. I could spend hours diving into the ways that ancient cultures used them and even how modern cultures do, but seagrasses are just so awesome that I have to pick which components of their awesomeness to cover at greater length. So let's move on to reason number 2 why seagrasses are vital to humans. And that's food. I mentioned before that seagrass beds are considered nursery habitats for many species of fish. Well, that's not just beneficial to the fish. It turns out that an estimated half of all commercially important fisheries worldwide get their start thanks to support from seagrass habitats. A bit of a startling number, so I tried to break it down a bit to see where the truth in the science actually lays. One paper I found from 2019 provides evidence of a direct link to seagrasses in over a fifth of the world's 25 largest fisheries. This includes species such as walleye, herring, and cod. It is theorized that without the support of seagrass nurseries, stocks of these commercially important fish could absolutely plummet, and our ability to catch and consume them would fall drastically in turn. So, to put it bluntly, if the seagrasses disappear, we might have to say goodbye to that tasty fish and chips on the menu at the pub. And that, my friends, is a future that I could not bear to live in. Reason number 3 that seagrasses are important to humans finally gives them the collegiate STEM degree that they rightfully deserve, awarding them the title of ecosystem engineer. It's a more fun way of saying that seagrasses have a large impact on the habitat that they're a part of. And when ecologists say large impact, they mean large impact. Like beavers building dams and altering the entirety of the flow of a river large. It's quite the respectable title. Seagrasses get to share in this prestige due to a lot of factors, but one that directly impacts us humans is the protection that they provide coastlines. That vast underground network of roots and rhizomes actually helps stabilize the seafloor that would otherwise just be shifting sediment, which actually helps reduce erosion and buffers the coastline against storms. The leaves themselves can actually slow the wave action of water headed towards the shore as well, slowing the process of erosion of the coastline. So, if you're rich enough to own and live in a beach house that is anywhere near a seagrass meadow, and you still want that house standing in 50 years, you might just want to do all that you can to keep that meadow around and healthy. And the rhizomes and roots don't just stabilize the sediment either, they oxygenate it too, benefiting any creature that lives in the sediment itself. Above that muck, it's been shown that the seagrasses can help clean the water around it, reducing pollutants like heavy metals and land runoff. To me, these swaying forests act as stabilizers in every sense of that word. They help prevent drastic shifts in the sediment when storms hit. They help protect the shoreline against erosion and receding. And they even clean the water to prevent it from becoming unlivable by the creatures that coexist within their canopies. Seagrasses know how they like it, and they fight hard to keep it that way. The fourth and final reason that seagrasses are critical to humans I saved for last, because it is one of the most fascinating concepts I have learned about recently. It's called blue carbon, and it's the idea that seagrasses and other coastal ecosystems can act as a way to capture and store carbon from the atmosphere. You hear a lot these days in the news about our carbon footprint, going green, or reducing emissions to save the planet. It's a lot of buzzwords that are associated with a divisive central concept called climate change. While it shouldn't be as divisive or debated as it is, the science is pretty darn clear here. Climate change is happening, and human atmospheric carbon emissions is the largest driver of this change. The more carbon we release into the air from the burning of fossil fuels, unsustainable agriculture, and industry, the worse shape our planet is going to be in the future. So enter blue carbon, stage left. A little ray of hope in a world of gloom and doom. The idea here is that the world's coastal ecosystems, these being mangroves, salt marshes, and of course seagrass meadows, have a superpower. The power to capture atmospheric carbon and, by utilizing it for photosynthesis, root growth, and other processes, literally trap the carbon in the ground. For the crime of warming our planet, they literally get sentenced to carbon prison. And if it's trapped in the sediment, well, I wouldn't exactly call it atmospheric carbon, now would you? Once captured by a coastal ecosystem, blue carbon can remain in the sediment for hundreds to thousands of years. One estimate from a 2017 study attributes over 80 million metric tons of carbon being captured and stored each year by seagrass meadows alone. That's not taking into account the mangroves or the tidal marshes. In more relatable terms, 1 acre of seagrass alone can, in 1 year, sequester up to 740 pounds of carbon, the same amount as a car driving 3,800 miles. The idea of carbon sinks is fascinating, and if you pay attention to the United Nations, you may have heard this term net zero by 2050. It's part of the UN global campaign Race to Zero. The idea here is to rally enough countries, cities, businesses, and the like to achieve a reduction in carbon emissions by 50% by 2030 and to achieve, quote, net zero, unquote, emissions by 2050. Blue carbon and the idea of carbon sinks play a large role in this, because the key word in that phrase is net. The initiative does not aim to stop all emission of carbon. That would be impossible. Rather, it aims to ensure that all carbon emissions by humans is met and balanced with an equal level of carbon removal. And blue carbon, currently, is a huge and very promising way to potentially help accomplish this. If we support seagrass meadows, mangroves, and tidal marshes, help them grow and rehabilitate lost stocks, protect them from future damage, and maybe even grow or farm them ourselves, we could be well on our way to a dream sustainable planet where consumerism, industry, and conservation could all coexist. And that might all be thanks to blue carbon. I just had a thought. I don't know about you, but blue carbon is 100% a superhero I could get behind. I need issues of The Amazing Adventures of Blue Carbon in my life, like right now. I can imagine her now, clad in seagrass instead of spandex, wielding mangrove root swords and hunting down and trapping monsters of carbon spawned from unsustainable industry practices. God, that sounds amazing. She'd be my absolute favorite. I don't care if it's Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, or Image Comics. Come on, let's get on it, guys. Or maybe we could cut a network deal for like a spiritual successor to Captain Planet. If you're the kind of person who needs cold, hard cash to be convinced of the value of seagrass, consider this. The services provided from a mere 2 football fields worth of seagrass beds are estimated to be worth $19,000 per year. These services, again, the support for fisheries, oxygen production, ecosystem stabilization, and blue carbon potential, all make seagrasses so important that the Paris Climate Agreement has recently placed increased global focus on the study and restoration of seagrass meadows. They're that important. And unfortunately, they're in decline. I know, I'm sorry, it's time for the part of the podcast that's the depressing conservation angle, but it wouldn't be a podcast about the ocean, though, without it. So what are the facts here? Some estimates place that we are losing seagrass beds at a rate of around 1.5% per year. If you do the math out, that's about a rate of 2 football fields per hour being lost. Add on top of that we've already lost an estimated 29% of our historical seagrass coverage. Things aren't looking too good. But, I still think that we have the possibility of hope. Seagrass beds are valuable, both monetarily and commercially. They're useful to meet our climate change goals. I don't think that it's out of the question to begin placing increased protections on these ecosystems or coming up with a more comprehensive restoration plan for something that's this dang useful. How we vote, from who leads us to how many resources that we can allocate to the research and conservation, has a huge impact. How we act as consumers and how we use our voices to fight for our planet can and does make a huge difference. So, today, instead of thinking about these facts as depressing and hopeless, I'd like to start thinking about them as opportunities to learn and do better. Remember the power that you as an individual have and think about what it is that you believe in. We can turn the tide, and I firmly believe that we will. And that concludes my hippie rant for the day. Looking back, seagrasses are pretty dang cool, huh? So, if you're a diver like me, or even an enthusiastic snorkeler, I humbly ask that you spare a second thought if you're lucky enough to find yourself exploring a seagrass bed. Just float for a few moments above the canopy and see what you can find. See the tiny creatures that call it home, and appreciate the advantages the grass provides them. Imagine the vast, art-like network of rhizomes and roots that stretches beneath what you can see as you watch the sway of the leaves. Think of the far-reaching effects this unassuming stalwart champion has on the beaches, on your diet, and on the planet. Even if you aren't coastal, the next time you're enjoying a nice hot basket of fish and chips with your favorite brew from the local pub, take a second to thank the seagrass for the delicious cod ye are about to consume. that wraps up today's episode of Bio-Diversity. If you liked it and think it deserves a vote for Best in Grass, leave a rating or a review. Just make sure you aren't doing so through the lens of rose-tinted grasses. Wait, is asking you to rate the podcast highly too aggressive of a strategy? Either way, I hope it inspires you to think about some things, like maybe reducing your gasoline consumption, or who you'll vote for Congress. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.